China, common prosperity. This is David Roche, Quantum Economics, Independent Strategy. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you are at, welcome. Today, I want to talk to you about what is a major change in Chinese policy under Xi Jinping. It is called common prosperity. It is almost like taking a whole slice of land, like in a Botticelli painting, and raising it to some mythical and golden city, backlit, of course, with an artificial blue sea lapping its shores, in which wide avenues and happy housing house even happier people. And on every building, there is, of course, a Communist Party Chinese flag, and smiles are all around. But that is to be, in a sense, overgraphical. It is true that this particular experiment, called common prosperity, aims to create a new middle class, not an egalitarian proletariat, but a new middle class out of the wood and rock of the Communist Party by hewing it out by social measures. So if you go back in history and you wonder how we all became middle class, basically our ancestors crawled out of the hellish vision of people like Blake and Dickens about the Industrial Revolution, which was, of course, an overly negative view, because in the end, it did create common prosperity to a very great degree in most of our societies. And indeed, China has already created a very large middle class. But this is different. Let me define what we are talking about here. We are essentially talking about the end of Wild West capitalism. So in the same way as it really came to an end in the United States with the robber barons, China is drawing the curtain on its own robber barons, the great well-known names which created enormous personal wealth, and then created, of course, a challenge to the Communist Party, which the Communist Party has now been dealing with effectively for nearly 1 year. We will go into that in a minute. So that is over. And now economic success is going to serve the people, not in the extremes of what I will call the robber barons, and not either in the common proletariat approach of traditional Marxist-Leninism, but in a way that seeks, as its explicit objective, is to create a middle class in Chinese society through a series of social and economic measures. Now, those social and economic measures are, at the moment, not vague in description, but they could fill many hours of video. And they are not laid out in what I would call a coherent economic plan for achieving them. But they have characteristics. And those characteristics go back actually to the Central Party Committee meetings in 2012, when common prosperity was first set, not as a slogan, but as an objective. But what is happening here is that a specific area, and it is noteworthy that China often launches major economic and social experiments in specific areas like economic free trading zones, economic development zones. All of these things were always launched in a specific area, not throughout the whole nation. And the specific area for the creation of this new common prosperity is around Hangzhou, is Zhejiang in the province is the name, in China. What it seeks to do is to enrich people through the development of technology and the service industry. through the development of labor mobility between surrounding, presumably, and far away uh, agricultural areas. So the Hangzhou policy becomes liberalized so that people can immigrate into these areas. The areas themselves seek to create not economic uh, egalitarianism, but to enrich people through small and medium-sized enterprises, through service enterprises. That is going to be the output method. Then there is the question of how these people can add to their wealth through their assets. And the characteristic of these areas is not only to allow people to own their own homes, but also that there would be availability of affordable homes, presumably on a rental basis. Similarly, people would be encouraged to expand their portfolios of financial assets. And most importantly, we would see the provision of social services through the state, something like Sweden, but of course without a vote, where people have proper health care, where education becomes affordable, where the old age of people is insured, rather than insured, it is insured by the state. And so interestingly, when you add up all the characteristics which cover pages of shared prosperity in this way, what you come to is a model in which the private sector role is actually rather diminished, certainly compared to the ways in which China has grown its economy in the last 10 to 15 years. The state's role is much bigger, not only as a source of production and a support for production, but in the role it plays in giving people housing, benefits, education, and so on. Now, this is not unconnected to other things that are happening in China. For example, we saw earlier this year Jack Ma, Alibaba, make an unfortunate statement about Chinese banks, state-controlled, being pawn shops, and we have hardly heard from him since. And since then, an enormous regulatory crackdown on companies which generate great personal wealth, which is seen as being a potential political contestatory force to the Chinese Communist Party. There has been an enormous crackdown. And this expanded, as we saw slightly later, to companies accumulating data. Now, of course, data accumulation is widespread in China, but it is seen to be a monopoly of the state. And we have three, at least, Chinese laws which govern data collection and protection, wending its way through legislation in China, most of which will become law by November the 1st. But what they do, all of these laws, is to limit the transfer of data abroad and the accumulation of data by the private sector in China. And it didn't stop there. The Chinese authorities then clamped down on private profit-making education and said that educating children should be a non-profit activity, with a result that a billion-dollar industry in China promptly collapsed. And education is now seen as being something in which the cost is reduced so that people will be encouraged to have more children. And having more children, say 3, under the Chinese objectives, would of course help to reverse the extremely negative demographic curve which China is seeing, where in particular educated young women are simply not having children. Then China has moved on. It has moved on to actually banning or limiting the number of hours which children can spend playing games on their consoles or interactive television. In my view, that is no bad thing. Maybe they will read books instead. But the reality is that China has, again, moved to change the nature of the way that society works. And it is quite clear that the reform process, the creation of shared prosperity, is not going to stop there. Next in line, I would say, is healthcare and housing, both of which represent prohibitive costs in China, particularly if you want to grow your younger population. Now, it is easy to say that this is all posturing. But in China, a shift of these proportions, backed by Xi Jinping and made a part of his ideological legacy and current study, by the way, as his thought has now got to be studied throughout the education system in China. These are never empty political slogans like in Western society. They result in action. Now, this action is very important to how we view China. We are in the middle of a big change in how the Chinese economy works, and therefore, of course, how Chinese society works. We are moving away from the period in which economic success resulted in enormous personal wealth. We are moving to a period in which economic success is spread not on an egalitarian basis throughout society, but is dedicated towards the creation of a middle class, which itself is a magnet to draw people who are not in the middle class into the middle class by allowing them to participate. So a much freer movement of labor, a much better distribution of education, and less pressure and elitism within the educational system to allow children to be children, and also to allow a greater and more widespread participation in the benefits of growth to the broader range of Chinese children. Now, you as a foreign investor need to be aware that this constitutes an opportunity, but it also constitutes a risk. The risk is that you may do your analysis on your favorite internet stock or whatever it may be, or online gambling stock, and come up with a well-argued fundamental case for investing in this stock. But you may wake up, even though your fundamental case is right, to a state intervention which will squish it. That has been the story over the last year, and it is the reason why Chinese stock markets have underperformed. Now, it is quite clear that Xi Jinping, setting the ideology, is prepared to put up with the economic cost of what this recasting of the objectives of society and the economy means in terms of capital flows and in terms of the damage it can do to the quotation or asset prices involved. But that is a price that he is prepared to pay. That is a price which is now becoming enshrined in the economic and social process of creating shared prosperity. You ignore it at your peril. It changes the way you evaluate your investments in China, and it changes the way profoundly in which the Chinese economy works. Will it happen? You can bet your bottom dollar. Indeed, you may have to.